Hello, it's Ruby, and today I have a long list of book recommendations to share with you. I often get questions about classic literature specifically and which books to read if you're just getting started with classics. So if you're just getting started with classics, you might want to read something shorter, something which isn't quite so daunting. These are two of my favourite books, Jane Eyre and A Tale of Two Cities, but they're quite daunting books to get started with. Like, they're good and you should read them, but if you're just getting started with classics, you might want something which just feels a bit more manageable, or if you're in education or you're working, you might want something that you can read more easily alongside other things. So that's where these books come in. All of these are under 200 pages, but I will also say some of them are more dense than others. Page count isn't always a reliable indicator of how long something is going to take you. Today's video is also sponsored by Fable, which is so exciting to be able to say. Fable is an incredible space for bookworms and readers to come together and discuss literature. And it basically encourages us to connect through reading. Storytelling is an inherently social thing, like we tell stories to other people. Inherent to storytelling is this act of sharing. And books are not solitary things because we're not the only ones who read them. There are thousands, millions of people who have read the classics, which we're going to talk about in today's video, for example. And talking about books is always so much fun. I ran 2 book clubs when I was at school, and it was some of my favourite time of the week, just having a space to talk about books. So I'm starting a book club through Fable, which so excited to be able to finally say. And if you've been here for a while, you might know that I did used to have a book club, which ended up being something of a fail. But since then, I've really wanted to come up with a more sustainable plan of action, because I really want us to talk about books together, but it's just finding the right space in which to do that. But Fable is really great for this. The book club that I've started on Fable, which I really hope you'll consider joining, is Reading with the Seasons. 2 of my favourite things are books and nature, and specifically I love the changing of the seasons, and I think there's something very powerful about reading seasonally. Like, you've heard of eating seasonally or living seasonally, but the idea with this book club is that we'll read books that link to that particular month. This month, I'm gonna do a little drum roll. That's really awkward. Drum rolls just feel very awkward. Do you remember how often we do those at school? So this month we're going to read The Enchanted April. Obviously, if we're going to read any book in April, it would have to be this one. And I really hope that you will join me in the club to discuss it. I can't wait to get started with reading this. There's a link in the description box which you can click. It's completely free, but then we can talk about this book. So you choose a book, and then it creates these kinds of chat rooms where you can talk about that book. And this is the really cool bit, it's separated per chapter, which means that when you're talking about it, you're not getting spoilers. If, for example, you're on chapter 17, you go to chapter 17 and you write your thoughts, and then you can talk with anyone else who is also reading chapter 17, which I just love. I think that's such a cool idea. The other cool thing, which I just want to quickly note, is, like, I've got the physical book, which I'm going to read because can't go wrong with the physical book, but on the app you can actually sample the ebook. If you're on the go and you want to read something or just start reading something, then you can do it directly on the app. The great thing too is that a lot of the classics are in the public domain, so you could read the whole of these books on your phone. And when you're going through, you can make notes. Okay, what should I highlight? This isn't a particularly insightful quote, but you never know, he said, when there'll be a rainy day and you'll be very glad to find you have a nest egg. So then you can just go highlight, and then you could share that with the group, and then you can click discuss, and then you can make a comment here about, like, how's anyone been? And then you can send that to the group. It's just a really intuitive way to talk about books and lead with the text when having these conversations. So anyway, I will stop rambling. If you do want to join, then please do click on the link, because I can't wait to get started reading this. This one actually isn't under 200 pages though. This is 260, so we're looking at books which are way shorter than this. And let's actually get into the video now. I will give a due warning that this video will be quite long because we're going to be talking about 50 books. So let's start off strong with one you know I'm going to mention, which is A Christmas Carol. If we're reading seasonally, maybe this isn't the one to start with. Tale of Two Cities and A Christmas Carol are both in the same book, so don't worry, it's not this. It's actually only 104 pages. I'm sure you know the story of A Christmas Carol. It's said to have eternalized Christmas. So much Christmas tradition can be found in this story, and for that reason it feels very nostalgic to read. Even if you've never read it before, it's like you're rereading. So it's worth reading because of the cultural importance, but also Dickens' writing style is a joy, a pleasure, a delight to be able to read. His descriptions are so sensory, so abundant, and especially when he describes marketplaces like he does in this book, when he's describing the food markets with the Ghost of Christmas Present. It's overwhelming how much there is, and there's something very warming about it, there's something very exciting about it. It's like when you go to a massive toy shop like Hamley's when you're a child and you're looking around and there's just so much that it's overwhelming. It's that feeling, that childlike excitement which Dickens is able to capture in this book. The great thing about reading A Christmas Carol is that you get a sense of Dickens' writing style, but you don't have to read like a massive 700-page book like Bleak House. I also just realised if I talk about every book for over a minute, this video will still be 50 minutes long, so I think I might have to be quite quick for going through. Next is The Greengage Summer by Rumer Godden, which is only 186 pages. This is actually a great classic for those of you who liked We Were Liars. It's a coming-of-age story about a family who are travelling to France for the summer holidays, but the mother falls ill right beforehand, so they arrive at the hotel and the children basically have to look after themselves. We see this awakening of the elder sister as she starts to fall in love. Next, Animal Farm by George Orwell, which is only 122 pages. Also very easy to read, so one of the quickest books on this list. This is an allegory of communism and specifically the events which were occurring in Russia at the time. Orwell explains why communism doesn't work in practice using an allegory of farm animals. So the farm animals drive out the farmer, take over the farm, and because the pigs are the most intelligent animals, they start to take on more power. It's a very interesting piece of political philosophy and like political criticism, and also just enjoyable to read, honestly. Next, Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. You might have seen the film. The book has got a very similar essence and air. So this is set in New York, of course, and we meet just one of the most mysterious, slightly bizarre characters, Holly Golightly, who we love as a character, but we also don't quite understand, and that's the joyful thing about her. She just seems so separate from this slightly grey narrative of our narrator. Next, De Profundis by Oscar Wilde. This is a letter which Oscar Wilde wrote whilst in prison. So he was of course imprisoned for being gay, and he wrote this letter to a friend. It's desperately sad, but also very profound, very wise, and has that typical wit that we associate with Oscar Wilde. So to be fair, The Picture of Dorian Gray isn't very long. It's like 200 and something pages, but if you are wanting to read some Oscar Wilde, then this might be a good place to start. Next is The Stranger by Albert Camus. This one says The Outsider. I think it translates differently. And this is explaining existentialism, but through fiction. I love fiction books that are basically philosophy books. It's such a great combination. So the narrator in this ends up killing somebody and then being put on trial, obviously. But the excellent thing is that he approaches the whole trial as an existentialist, and he doesn't see any real value or point to any of it. And this means that while he's sat in the trial, he is just kind of like observing how bizarre the whole situation is. It ends up being this critique of like modern justice system, but also just the way that there is any structure to society at all. If you want to kind of like learn about existentialism by example, then this is a great one to read. Next is my favourite short story ever. Yes, forever, which is Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville. It's set in the second half of the 19th century in New York, and this man gets a job as a scrivener in this office on Wall Street. At first he's, you know, like he's a little bit strange, but not too much, and he kind of gets on with his work and everything's okay. But then he starts saying, I would prefer not to. Every time that somebody asks him to do something, he just goes, I prefer not to. I prefer not to. He's not saying yes, he's not saying no. It's defiance, but it's not blatant defiance. The narrator finds it very hard to handle and to react to, and it's a great critique on the new city culture and capitalism which was arising at the time. Next, A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, only 112 pages. So Virginia Woolf is about to deliver a lecture on women and fiction and writing. We hear her process of preparing for this and kind of thinking about women and writing. Basically, like the crux that she gets to is that historically women haven't been able to write in the same way as men because they haven't had a room of one's own to write in. You need a room of one's own, you need the space, you need the time, which women historically haven't had. So this essay really acknowledges the privilege that is tied up with writing and tied up with the voices that we hear through books. It's an excellent essay and some great feminist writing. The Great Gatsby is only 189 pages. The classic story narrated by Nick Carraway, and he meets his extravagant neighbour Gatsby, who throws these elaborate parties every night. Gatsby is obsessed with the idea of having Daisy. He's been in love with her for years, and basically everything that he's been building up has been in pursuit of Daisy. So it's a story of kind of unrequited love, but also jealousy and ambition and the American dream. I also want to recommend The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, which is only 46 pages, and this is my favourite piece of writing personally by Fitzgerald. It's again a critique of wealth inequality. Fitzgerald was very interested in the extravagance and the exuberance of wealth in the 1920s in America. Lots of people were earning a lot of money very quickly, and the wealth divide was becoming much more pronounced, and he was interested in the extent of that extravagance, and Diamond as Big as the Ritz is perhaps his biggest critique of this. A young man who goes to stay with a friend over the holidays. His friend has been bragging all term that his father owns a diamond which is big as the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and obviously the friend's going, ah ha ha, obviously not, that's completely ridiculous. But then he gets there and there literally is this massive diamond, and the more that he learns about this family, the more that he is exposed to this wealth, the more twisted it becomes. Songs of Innocence and Experience by William Blake is only 56 pages, and it's a collection of poetry. He writes a lot of nature poetry. He also thinks about God, religion, Christianity a lot. Next, Macbeth by William Shakespeare. I could sit here and recommend you to read all of Shakespeare's plays because they're all very short, honestly, but Macbeth is his shortest. It's only 97 pages, but it depends on the edition that you have. I'd say if you're going to read any of Shakespeare's plays, probably The Scottish Play is the one to read, because it's just got all of the great things which a Shakespeare play has, because it's a tragedy, and sorry, but his tragedy is the best. But also you've got the witches, which adds this fun supernatural element, especially combined with King James I's fears of witchcraft. You've got this political subversion embedded into this play inherently. But also, and the main reason why you should read Macbeth is because of Lady Macbeth. I feel like everyone wants to play Lady Macbeth. She's just the most incredible character. Shakespeare's poetry in this play is also unrivaled. He describes the multitudinous seas in Carnarvon as this image of his guilt. It's just fantastic. Next, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which is only 126 pages, and it is a children's book, but C.S. Lewis says that children's books, if they're good, can be enjoyed by adults and children alike. It's one of the first real children's books where the intention is enjoyment for the child as opposed to just moral lessons, which is a lot of what children's literature used to be. The book itself is just so clever. Lewis Carroll is such a witty, intelligent, intentional writer. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury is 175 pages. Basically, it's a society where books are illegal and they are burnt. Fahrenheit 451 is the temperature at which books burn. And this book is narrated by a book firefighter. Literally, his job is to visit libraries and burn them down. If you are wanting to read a Sherlock Holmes book, the shortest Sherlock Holmes is The Hound of Baskervilles, which is only 112 pages. Like with the Dickens, you really get a sense of Arthur Conan Doyle's writing style. So basically, Sherlock decides that he is way too busy to take on this case, so he sends Watson down to Devonshire to investigate on his behalf and then send back word. And there's this legend, this myth which surrounds this family, that this massive supernatural hound has pursued and haunted the family for centuries. And I just love the atmosphere of this book because they're out on the moors and you've got the mist and it's all cold. The next one is a must read, which is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, only 96 pages. Frederick Douglass is actually the most photographed man of the 19th century, which is really cool. So Frederick Douglass was born into slavery, later was able to escape slavery and flee to New York, and he became a champion for abolition. The book chronicles his life and shares his story, shares his experience of being enslaved, and then this book was really importantly used as support for the abolitionist movement. So just the history of kind of how the book was used in itself makes it a valuable thing to read, but the story itself is remarkable. Next, only 128 pages, Sylvia Plath's Ariel poems. I've got this really beautiful edition. Sylvia Plath was writing in the early 20th century, like especially over the war, and her poems are desperately sad. She struggled with postnatal depression, and her experiences with like mental health treatment especially are absolutely barbaric. She actually did have electroshock therapy, for example. This is the last poetry collection that she published. It was published after her death, and it just gives this real glimpse into not only her depression but also her experience of womanhood. Picnic at Hanging Rock next by Joan Lindsay, which is set in rural Australia. On this picnic, 3 of the students of this school go missing, as well as a teacher, and the book basically chronicles the repercussions of this. One of the great things about this book actually, which is kind of unrelated to the plot, the writing style is just so pleasant, and it really captures like summer very well. The Nutcracker by E.T.A. Hoffmann is 96 pages, and again, a Christmas story, as you probably know. It's very different to the ballet though. It's a very easy one to read and very comforting as well. I like to read this every December. There are so many short stories I could recommend by Edgar Allan Poe, but the one I'm going to go for is The Telltale Heart, which is 68 pages. There are much shorter ones too. If you look at his collection of the murders of the Rue Morgue, then there are loads in there ranging from like 3 pages to maybe like 30 or 40. It's about a murderer, of course it would be with Edgar Allan Poe. This man murders somebody and then is driven mad, completely berserk by the guilt. Like, I just love how Edgar Allan Poe writes about madness. He captures it in like the rhythm of the writing, and it's terrifying to read, honestly, like especially when he's waiting to kill the man. Like, your heart is beating with that Telltale Heart. It's very similar to the Telltale Heart as well is De Quincey's Murder as Considered One of the Fine Arts, which is 55 pages. And there was the society which De Quincey was part of, which was all about appreciating the art and the act of murder. So thinking about like how it can be artful, and thinking about how murder can be a beautiful thing when done correctly. As I say, thank goodness it's satire, but it's also really interesting to read, honestly. Another essay on The Pleasure of Hating by William Hazlitt, which is 128 pages. Don't really agree with this, but it's interesting. So the idea is that humans are conditioned to hate, and Hazlitt spends the essay arguing that if we live alongside something for long enough, we will grow to hate it, and we love the act of hating and we're conditioned to love hating. I think it's a very cynical worldview. The Metamorphosis by Frank Kafka. 87 pages. Again, existentialist, again using fiction to explore philosophy. Metamorphosis is about a man called Gregor. He's a salesman and he's living this dreary, monotonous, every day is the same life, when one day he wakes up and he's an insect. He's a giant beetle. It just offers this really dark perspective on individualism and what it means to live, because Gregor ironically becomes more unique and becomes more individual and gains more identity in being transformed into a beetle than if he just remained being a salesman. Like, that dichotomy is just, yeah, it will make you question everything if you read this book, but that's exactly why you should. The Professor's House by Willa Carter. Did not realise this was under 200 pages, so I was very excited to see that because I can recommend it. It's 168 pages. He's about to move house. He doesn't really want to move. He's got so much emotionally tied to his original house, namely his relationship with a former student, Tom, basically his best friend, and he became a mentor to him, but also the other way around. The professor learned so much from Tom. It's a story about obsession and aging, nostalgia, and the impossibility of leaving behind friendships. We're halfway through, let's keep going. Death in Venice, only 72 pages, by Thomas Mann, and this is so good. Why do I keep on saying I loved it? If I'm recommending it, then obviously you can assume that I liked it. So Death in Venice is narrated by a writer, and he went to Venice in the hopes of writing, but instead he just becomes obsessed by this boy that he keeps on seeing on the beach. He keeps going to the beach every day in hopes of seeing him again, and follows him and his family around. It's honestly quite disturbing. It feels a little bit like Lolita. It does also feel slightly existentialist, again using fiction in order to explore psychological, philosophical questions about what it means to be human. It's just a book worth reading, and it's very insightful, and I also love his writing style, honestly. Meditations on the First Philosophy by René Descartes is only 52 pages and one of the most influential pieces of philosophy which has been written. It was published in the 1600s, but it's short, so even though it's dense and maybe a little bit hard to read, it is short and it is manageable. Descartes' philosophy basically says that we can't make any assumptions about anything and we can't claim to know anything, like we've got to prove everything. We can't just accept beliefs. But he does accept that you can just accept that God exists. So you've got like you've got a very strange dichotomy in his work. The other piece of philosophy I will recommend is Plato's Meno, which is 114 pages, one of Plato's most famous pieces of work. And this is just great if you want to again get a sense of the Socratic dialogues and how they operate, because as a literary form they have been very influential. It's kind of where the idea of using fiction to understand philosophy comes from. If you want something very short, try Hero and Leander by Christopher Marlowe, which is only 26 pages. It's like a Greek mythology retelling. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I'm so pleased. This is 152 pages. It depends on the edition. Sometimes the edition is like 300 pages, but I found an edition that was 152, so I'm going to include it on this list because it's one of my favourite books. Mary Shelley wrote it when she was very young. She was 17. Rumour has it that she wrote it in one night during a storm in Geneva. The backstory of it is just as exciting. It's about Victor Frankenstein, who he wants to create life by sewing together parts of people, and he creates what he calls a monster, and you end up with this layered narrative where we hear from Victor Frankenstein, we also hear from a sailor, but we hear most importantly from the monster itself. So good, honestly, like one of the best books. Gulliver's Travels, again, did not realise this was only 184 pages. This was written back in the 1600s. You would not realise it if you read it now. It feels like it could have been written in like the last 50 years as he's travelling the world. So he comes across one country where everyone's very small, one country which is run by horses. It's a funny piece of satire. Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson, 42 pages, and personal favourite of Emerson's work. I think his essays are better than his poetry. There are cases where Emerson has said like, oh yes, I want to be remembered as one of the great poets, and you can tell he has this ambition to be known as one of the great poets, but he's a much better essayist in my opinion. The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas is another short story, only 32 pages, kind of about complicity, how perfection is impossible. So it's the society where everything seems to be perfect, everyone is happy, but for everybody to be happy there must be a single child being tortured underground. Kind of explores like utilitarianism. Is it okay for all of these people to be exuberantly happy at the expense of this one person? Blithe Spirit by Noah Coward. I actually did a Lambda piece for this for my grade 8. Desperately funny play. You've got a seance at the beginning and this couple ends up being haunted by a ghost. The Woman in Black by Susan Hill is 138 pages. You might have seen the film. The book I think is so much better. Very atmospheric, very creepy, very spooky. This man visits this haunted house which exists on the other side of the marshland. He stays there overnight. He's trying to sort out like affairs. He's a lawyer or something. Like as the night proceeds, he realises that it's haunted. Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell is only 130 pages. He also wrote History of Western Philosophy, which is like 900 pages, also worth reading, but Problems of Philosophy is a good one if you again want to be introduced to Bertrand Russell's work. He's one of the most prolific philosophers of the 20th century. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. The book is about two men, George and Lenny, who are working on this farm as labourers in California, and it's set in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Again, it has these themes of the American dream and offers this like distinction between real life and a dream world. Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson, 192 pages, nearly there at 200 but not quite. This is Jeanette Winterson's memoirs. She grew up in a highly ascetic Christian household, and this is the story of her childhood. Jeanette Winterson, the main thing is her writing, like it's the style more than the content, specifically how she blurs this line between fiction and reality. So she's telling a memoir, but she also recognises that so much of this is made up, so much of it is fiction, and I guess it kind of gets us to think as well about like what is memory and can we trust our memories. Don't Look Now by Daphne du Maurier is a collection of short stories. It has been ages since I read these, so I feel quite bad actually recommending them. It's a short story about grief. These parents have recently lost a daughter to this tragic accident, and the couple has travelled to Venice where the father is restoring a church. They meet these people who say that they can put the couple back in touch with their dead daughter, and I do want to reread this now that it's kind of popped back up. Song of Myself by Walt Whitman is part of Leaves of Grass, but it's an extended poem. It's only 48 pages. You have a real sense of like the narrator as an individual person, but also he fits into a wider democracy, a wider American society. That like idea of unity and community is really beautifully done in this poem. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, which is a classic story. Mary Lennox goes to the Yorkshire moors. She is been described as a contrary child. Never had any friends, she's always been very isolated, but she finds this secret garden and starts to tend to this garden and welcome the beginning of spring, and also kind of awaken something beautiful and kind in herself. And the other Frances Hodgson Burnett, which of course I'm going to recommend, is A Little Princess, again a children's book. This is my favourite book of all time though. It's the story of Sarah Crewe, a very wealthy girl who is sent to boarding school at the age of 7, and whilst she is at school her father dies and she is shunted into poverty. She was once like the parlour boarder at the school, but instead she becomes a scullery maid and she lives up in the attic, and we see this riches to rags story. But the important and the very valuable thing about this book is how Sarah reacts to it. It's called Little Princess because she always thinks of herself as being a princess in the way that she acts. I love this book because just Sarah's character is so admirable in her kindness, in her stoicism. The Sandman by Hoffman is the example of the uncanny, 52 pages, and this is creepy. Before I read this, I always thought of the Sandman as in Rise of the Guardian, the Sandman delivering dreams. Oh my gosh, no. The actual story of the Sandman is there is this mythical figure called the Sandman who comes to children who will not go to bed and steals their eyes. I'm sorry, that's so messed up and so creepy and so uncanny, but we see this materializing over the course of these 52 pages. So if you want something creepy, this is the one to read. Next, The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, which is 54 pages. Beautiful, desperately sad poem. This isn't me saying that the poem isn't about anything, because there are definitely themes, but it doesn't really have a plot. Some people say that it's a commentary on the First World War and the world after the First World War and how it can't ever quite recover. I mean, I'm going to be very honest with you, I don't know entirely what I make of it as an entirety. When I do read The Wasteland, I tend to dip into it as I would a poetry collection, because the individual lines are so rich and there's so much you can gain from the individual lines, but I'm not quite sure what I make of it as like a whole poem. The really great thing about this book is how much it uses allusion, so each of the lines is just embedded with reference. So much of it you won't get and so much of it you will get, and different people will take different things out of it, and I think that's really cool. So when I read The Wasteland for the first time, I just read Tamburlaine and I picked up on these very vague references to Tamburlaine. It's funny because I just would not have noticed that at all if I hadn't just read that. So, and it's very, very rich. It's beautifully rich writing and carefully crafted. A Night to Remember by Walter something. It's by Walter Lord and published in 1952. It's a history of the Titanic. Personal favourite book on the Titanic. If you're wanting to learn more about it, this is the book to read. It takes testimonies and then it puts them all together to create a kind of minute by minute narrative of what happened. Painter of Modern Life by Charles Baudelaire. Favourite essay ever. It's basically about the process of creation and the process of painting and why artists are needed. So the idea is that an artist will see beauty that other people will not usually see, and then their job is to try and capture that through an art form. The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She moves to a new house and she's locked away in this attic where the wallpaper is yellow, and she becomes obsessed by the patterns on the wallpaper. She has paper and she's writing, she's keeping this journal about what she sees, but she has to keep on hiding the paper as her husband comes because he can't see that she's writing. You see her just slowly but surely going mad. Then Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, again a classic children's book, one that I think everyone should read. Very different to the Disney film, which is why I think it's especially worth reading the book for this one, because it's the writing with J.M. Barrie, like with Lewis Carroll actually, which makes it so excellent, so profound. And then finally I Am David by Anne Holm. Again, not sure whether to count this as a classic, but I think it should be a classic, so let's canonise it. This book is 191 pages, again just on the upper side, and it's about a 12-year-old boy who escapes from a concentration camp during the Second World War in the Holocaust and then travels alone through Switzerland, Greece, Italy. It's a book of survival but also of reflection, and there's this beautiful moment where he tries an orange for the first time. He finds this orange when he's in Greece or Italy and he eats it, and the description of this orange, it's one of the best pieces of food writing I think ever. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. Don't know how long it is. I put aside an hour to film this video and it's taken me 2 hours. Hopefully I've managed to cut this down to 30 or 45 minutes. But thank you so much. Thank you again to Fable for sponsoring today's video as well. The Enchanted April is the book of the month for this month, and I can't wait to read this with you to start discussing it. As I say, click on the link in the description if you want to join the book club. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have a productive week, and that you read a good book. Put some time aside to read.